In March of 1968, Stanley Hollis stood at the back row of the Crislow County Co-op Meeting Hall on the second floor of the feed store in Black Hollow Junction, Missouri, and listened to Marvin Beatty laugh. Beatty was 47 years old, the co-op chairman, 5'10", and stocky in tan slacks and a blue button-down under a dark wool coat, and he had a wooden clipboard in his left hand and a fountain pen in his right that he used the way other men used a finger. "A Frostbox," Beatty said, and let the word sit there in the room until two of the men at the front table laughed with him. Stanley wants to dig himself a hole in the ground on the north side of Buckhorn Ridge, 12 feet deep, 14 feet wide, 22 feet long, and he wants the co-op to lend him $2,200 to do it. Beatty tapped the clipboard with the pen 3 times and shook his head. "A hole in the ground is a hole in the ground, gentlemen. The man's father built one in 1919, and it caved in by 1924. We are not in the cave-digging business." There was more laughter then, the looser kind, and the heat from the iron stove at the front of the room rose up into the rafters and held. Stanley Hollis stood at the back row and said nothing. He was 64 years old. He held a 1907 USDA pamphlet folded twice in his right hand, pencil marked in the margins by his father in 1919, and again by him in 1948. And in his left hand he held the hand-drawn aquifer thermal map his father had left him when he died in 1953, a sheet of yellow ledger paper showing the cold spring under Buckhorn Ridge and the limestone fissure behind it that drew air at 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. He wore a faded canvas Alice Chalmers ball cap, silver wire-rimmed glasses, a faded canvas work jacket open over a chambray blue shirt, and scuffed brown work boots dusted with the limestone he had been chipping at for 2 months already on his own time. He had taken his hat off when he came into the room. He had not put it back on. The vote went 11-3. Stanley Hollis stood up from the back row, walked the length of the meeting hall in 9 measured steps, and at the front he stopped at the table and laid his rough, calloused hand flat on the wood for one breath. He said thank you to the chairman in a voice that did not rise above the level of a man asking for a glass of water. Then he turned and walked out, without putting his ball cap back on until he was through the door and on the staircase landing in the cold March air. That was the first turning point in the life of a man who would not have called it a turning point. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam the door. He thanked the 11 men who had just told him no, and he walked down the staircase to his pickup truck, and he drove the 6 miles east on Route 14 home. That night, at the kitchen table in the farmhouse on the 180 acres, Stanley Hollis unfolded the 1907 USDA pamphlet under the kerosene lamp and began to copy his father's pencil margins into a fresh, greasy pocket notebook bound with a red rubber band. He copied them in his own hand because the pamphlet's paper was 40 years old in 1948 and 61 years old now, and he did not want to lose what was on it. His wife, Hazel, poured coffee. She did not ask him about the meeting. She had been married to him for 39 years, and she knew when the kitchen was supposed to be quiet. The 11 votes had been cast by men who had not read the pamphlet. The pamphlet was titled Underground Cool Storage for Northern and Border State Farms, Bulletin Number 287 of the United States Department of Agriculture, dated April of 1907, written by an agronomist named G.K. Holderness, who had walked the limestone country of southern Missouri and northern Arkansas in the summer of 1905, measuring chamber temperatures in 17 old root cellars cut into north-facing hillsides between Springfield and the Buffalo River. Stanley Hollis's father, Eldon Hollis, had bought the pamphlet by mail order for 10 cents in November of 1908 and had carried it folded twice in his chest pocket until the spring of 1919, when he had walked the north shoulder of Buckhorn Ridge with a steel rod and a brass thermometer, and had drawn the aquifer thermal map at the kitchen table over the course of 9 evenings in February of 1920. He had begun digging a chamber that summer. He had run out of money in the summer of 1924, shored what he had with rough oak timbers, and walked away from the work he had started, never to return to it. He had told his son Stanley about the chamber once in October of 1951, 2 years before he died, in a single conversation at this same kitchen table that lasted 41 minutes by the wall clock. Stanley had been 47 years old. He had listened. He had not interrupted. He had taken the pamphlet and the map from his father's hand at the end of the conversation and put them in a tin biscuit box on the top shelf of the pantry, and had not opened the box again until the morning of the co-op meeting in March of 1968. The next morning, Stanley Hollis was on the north shoulder of Buckhorn Ridge with a hand pick and a chisel and a steel-handled mason's hammer at 6:45 in the morning. The temperature was 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The limestone shelf he was working into ran 14 feet wide and 22 feet long along the natural cool sink behind the cold spring, and the fissure his father had drawn on the map opened 12 feet back into the hill at a draw of 52 degrees year-round. He worked alone. He worked 4 hours that first morning, and he came back at 1 in the afternoon and worked 4 more, and at the end of the day he had moved a cubic yard of limestone scree by hand into a wheelbarrow and out to the edge of the cleared shelf. He had $1,140 of his own savings in a coffee can in the kitchen pantry. He had set $1,400 aside for the co-op loan match. He used the $1,140 for hand-quarried stone, 2 cast-iron vents, a heavy oak chamber door with iron straps that the blacksmith in Black Hollow Junction would build him for $62, and the brass thermometer from the agricultural supply house in Springfield for $3.90. He paid the blacksmith, a man named Ronnie Pemberton, who was no relation to the Pembertons of the next county west, in 4 installments of $15.50 apiece, in October and November of 1968 and in March and June of 1969. He paid for the hand-quarried stone with 2 heifers traded to a quarryman named Gerald Mossman, who worked a small limestone face 4 miles south of Black Hollow Junction on County Road C. The 2 heifers were valued at $148 apiece in the trade, and Stanley Hollis came home with 11 cords of clean-cut limestone block, each block measuring 14 by 10 by 6 inches, stacked on a flatbed wagon pulled by Mossman's 2 Belgian draft horses. He stacked the blocks himself at the mouth of the chamber on the north shoulder of Buckhorn Ridge between 5:30 and 7:30 on the morning of June 19, 1969, and he was 65 years old that summer. The summer of 1968 he dug. The summer of 1969 he lined the chamber walls with hand-quarried limestone, set in a bed of lime mortar he mixed himself in a wheelbarrow at the mouth of the chamber 3 batches a day, working from May 12th to September 28th. The summer of 1970, he set the vent pipes through the natural fissure at the back of the chamber and hung the heavy oak chamber door on its iron straps, and drove the first iron staple into the jamb on August 4th. He kept his greasy pocket notebook in his chest pocket, and he wrote in it every evening at the kitchen table after Hazel went to bed. The men at the co-op talked about him for a while in 1968, and then they stopped talking about him because he had stopped coming to meetings. Marvin Beatty saw him once in October of 1969 at the feed store on the square in Black Hollow Junction. Stanley Hollis was loading 2 bags of lime into the bed of his pickup. Beatty walked past him and did not speak, and Stanley Hollis did not look up. The pamphlet was folded twice in his chest pocket beside the notebook and the red rubber band. In July of 1971, on a Wednesday afternoon, at 12:48 in the afternoon by his father's pocket watch, Stanley Hollis stood inside the 3rd stage of the chamber he had built by hand over 3 summers, and he watched the brass thermometer on the limestone wall settle on 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The outside temperature in Black Hollow Junction at that same minute was 96 degrees. The differential was 58 degrees. He stayed in the chamber for 10 minutes by the pocket watch. He did not say anything aloud because there was no one to say it to, and because saying it aloud was not the kind of thing his father had taught him to do. He held the watch in one hand, and the brass thermometer was at his eye level on the wall, and the cold sink at his feet drew steady from the fissure behind the back wall, and he counted 10 minutes by the second hand, and then he climbed the 4 limestone steps out of the chamber and shut the heavy oak door behind him and drove the iron drop bar through the staple. That was the second turning point in his life, and he told no one about it for the next 2 years. He did not tell Hazel. He did not tell the blacksmith in Black Hollow Junction who had built the door. He wrote it down in the greasy pocket notebook at 9:17 that evening at the kitchen table, in pencil, under the kerosene lamp. And he closed the notebook and put it back in his chest pocket and went to bed. If this story is finding you tonight, take a moment to press the like button below. It helps stories like this find the men who still know what waiting looks like. The autumn of 1971, Stanley Hollis hung his first quarter of beef in the chamber on October 16th at 4 in the afternoon, and he hung a slab of cured pork shoulder and 22 pounds of his wife's hand-churned butter wrapped in waxed paper at 4:11, and he closed the door and dropped the bar. The chamber temperature at that minute read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The outside temperature was 68. He came back the next morning at 6. The chamber temperature read 41. He came back 4 days later. The chamber temperature read 40. He came back 14 days later in the first week of November. The chamber read 41. The beef hung clean. The butter held. The first season storage, October of 1971 through March of 1972, was 146 pounds of beef, 84 pounds of pork, 51 pounds of butter, and 360 pounds of apples in slatted oak crates set on the lower iron racks. The chamber lost less than 1% of the stored weight to spoilage across that first winter. A single quart jar of preserved peaches that Hazel had set in the chamber against Stanley's word, and which had cracked at the rim during the first February freeze. Stanley wrote the loss in the notebook in pencil, 1 quart. He did not blame his wife. He wrote underneath it, in his father's careful margin template, "Not the chamber's fault." For 16 quiet seasons from 1972 through 1987, Stanley and Hazel Hollis used the Frostbox for their own meat and their own butter and their own springhouse milk and their own apples from the 11 trees on the south orchard. The chamber held between 38 and 42 degrees year-round, summer and winter, in the August heat and in the January thaw. And the brass thermometer never read above 43 and never read below 36 in those 16 years. He wrote the daily readings in the greasy pocket notebook at the kitchen table after supper. The notebook filled, and he started a second one in 1979 and a third one in 1985. In the summer of 1976, their grown son, Daniel's father, drove down from St. Louis with his wife and their 2-year-old boy in the back seat of a 1972 Ford Galaxy and stayed for 9 days at the farmhouse. Stanley took the 2-year-old to the chamber on the second morning of the visit. He carried the boy on his hip down the limestone steps, set him on a hand-quarried block at the back of the chamber by the iron grate at the fissure, and let him watch the brass thermometer for 1 minute by the pocket watch. The boy was wide-eyed and quiet. The chamber read 39. Stanley said one sentence to him in the cool quiet, which was, "This is what your great-grandfather drew in 1919. Then he carried the boy back up the steps and shut the door. He wrote the visit in the notebook that evening in pencil. Daniel Hollis was the boy. Daniel Hollis would remember the brass thermometer. He did not tell the co-op. He did not tell Marvin Beatty. He did not tell the men in the feed store on the square in Black Hollow Junction. The 11 men who had voted no in 1968 were 11 men who had been told no by him in return, in the only way a man like Stanley Hollis told anyone no, which was by saying nothing at all and going home and doing the work alone. Marvin Beatty had his own private turning point in August of 1980, although he would not have used the word. That summer, there was a smaller power outage in Crislow County, 18 hours long, on a Tuesday afternoon when an electrical storm took down a transformer on Route 14 at the junction with County Road C. Beatty's dairy operation, which he ran on the south side of Black Hollow Junction with 1,200 head of milking Holsteins and 3 walk-in refrigerated coolers and a refrigerated tanker bay, lost 3 days of milk before the power came back and before the bulk tanker could come up from Springfield to haul out what could still be hauled. Beatty stood at the door of his largest walk-in cooler at 3 in the afternoon on the third day, in tanned slacks and a blue button-down with sweat rings under the arms, and he looked at the warm cans and the warm tanker and the milk that had soured at 58 degrees because the cooler had risen to 58 in 18 hours of dead compressors. He said nothing aloud. He did not laugh. He did not point with the pen. He stood at the door of his own walk-in cooler, and he was quiet for the length of time it took a man to count out the loss in his head, which for Marvin Beatty in the summer of 1980 was $4,800 at 18 cents a pound. He went back into the dairy office and wrote the loss into the ledger and fountain pen, and he did not speak about it to his foreman, and he did not speak about it to his wife at supper that evening. That was Beatty's second turning point, and he told no one about it either, and he did not connect it to the meeting hall in March of 1968 because he had taught himself not to remember the meeting hall in March of 1968. Stanley Hollis was 66 years old by then. Hazel was 63. The Frostbox had been holding at 38 to 42 degrees for 9 consecutive summers. By the summer of 1985, the chamber had passed 13 years of continuous service. By the summer of 1987, it had passed 15. The brass thermometer Stanley Hollis had bought for $3.90 in 1968 had been mounted on the same hand-quarried limestone block at the same eye level on the south wall of the chamber for 19 consecutive years, and had not failed once. The cast iron vents at the back fissure had been cleaned of cobweb and dust 4 times a year, every spring, equinox, and every fall equinox, and every solstice, by Stanley Hollis with a soft brass bristled brush. He logged each cleaning in the notebook and pencil, dated and signed with his initials, S.H., in the same place on the page every time. The summer of 1988 was the hottest summer in Missouri since the dust years. The National Weather Service station at Springfield recorded 107 degrees on the 11th of August. The station at Joplin recorded 109 on the same day. The high-pressure ridge that had set up over the Mississippi Valley in late July refused to break, and on the morning of August 12th at 4:42 a.m., the regional power grid that fed Crislow County and the 4 counties around it failed. 2 transformers blew at the substation outside of Black Hollow Junction. A third blew an hour and 20 minutes later at the substation on Route 14. The grid was down for 9 days. Every refrigerated barn in 3 counties failed. Marvin Beatty's 1,200 head of milking Holsteins were dry tanked and trucked to Springfield by the second day, but the 3 walk-in coolers and the bulk tanker bay rose to 91 degrees by the end of day 1, and the meat lockers down at the slaughterhouse on Route 9 in Black Hollow Junction lost their entire August inventory by the morning of day 3. 62,000 pounds of beef and pork in the slaughterhouse alone, 41,000 more in the smaller refrigerated barns in Crislow County. The smell of the failed coolers carried on the wind for 6 miles. On the morning of day 3, August 14th at 6:52 in the morning, the first dust-covered pickup truck came up the dirt lane on the north side of Buckhorn Ridge. It was driven by a man named Ernest Tregenna, who had 31 steers hanging at the slaughterhouse, and a wife and 2 grown sons depending on the income from those steers. He had heard from the blacksmith in Black Hollow Junction, who had heard from his cousin, who lived 4 farms over, that Stanley Hollis up on Buckhorn Ridge had a thing dug into the hillside that was still cold. Tregenna got out of the pickup at the head of the dirt lane and walked the last 40 feet to the chamber door. Stanley Hollis was standing at the heavy oak chamber door in his faded canvas work jacket and his Alice Chalmers ball cap, with a clipboard in his hand and a brass key on a leather lanyard around his neck. The chamber temperature, with the door shut and the iron bar dropped, read 41 degrees Fahrenheit at 6:52 on the morning of August 14th, 1988, with the outside temperature already at 91 and rising. Stanley Hollis quoted Ernest Tregenna, a price of 18 cents a pound for storage by the day, exactly the price his father's notebook from 1919 had said was fair, adjusted by his own calculations for the silver standard and the cost of cured oak and hand-quarried limestone. Ernest Tregenna nodded once. He did not haggle. He went down the lane and came back 2 hours later with a Chevrolet flatbed and 4,100 pounds of his own beef cut and wrapped, and Stanley Hollis hung it in the chamber on the iron racks his father had drawn into the margin of the 1907 pamphlet 69 years ago. The second pickup truck up the lane that day was Marvin Beatty's. Beatty was 67 years old by then, retired from the chairmanship of the co-op for 2 years, still running the dairy on the south side of Black Hollow Junction. He drove a 1984 Chevrolet half-ton in dust-covered factory blue. He pulled up at the head of the dirt lane at 1:28 in the afternoon on August 14th, and he got out of the pickup and he walked the 40 feet to the chamber door alone. He was wearing tan slacks and a blue button-down and the same dark wool coat he had worn in the meeting hall in March of 1968, although now the coat was 2 sizes too large for the way age had worked on him. Stanley Hollis was at the chamber door with the clipboard. The chamber temperature at that minute read 41 degrees. The outside temperature was 103. Stanley Hollis quoted Marvin Beatty the same price he had quoted Ernest Tregenna at 6:52 that morning, 18 cents a pound by the day. He did not raise his voice. He did not look up from the clipboard. Marvin Beatty stood at the heavy oak chamber door in the 103-degree afternoon sun on the north shoulder of Buckhorn Ridge, with the cool 52-degree air drawing steady out of the open doorway across his face, and he said only 6 words. He said, "Stanley, I had it wrong." That was Beatty's third turning point and the only one he ever spoke aloud. Stanley Hollis nodded once at the clipboard and wrote down the weight Beatty had quoted him: 3,240 pounds of dairy butter and cured pork from Beatty's own walk-in cooler down the hill. He did not look at Beatty's face when he wrote. By the end of day 3 of the outage, the chamber held 14,080 pounds of meat and butter, hung in iron racks built from the 1907 pamphlet's drawings at 41 degrees Fahrenheit in a 103-degree August afternoon, lit by the same brass thermometer Stanley Hollis had bought for $3.90 in 1968. By the end of day 5, the chamber held 17,200 pounds. By the end of day 7, 18,400. The chamber temperature on day 7, with 18,400 pounds of stored meat and butter, and the heavy oak door opening 22 times that day for new arrivals, read 42. On day 8, it read 41. On day 9, when the grid came back at 3:11 in the afternoon, it read 41 again, and Stanley Hollis was sitting on a hand-quarried limestone block at the mouth of the chamber, with the greasy pocket notebook open on his knee, writing the final tally of weights and dollars by family name and pencil under the slow August light. The total storage charge across the 9 days came to $4,912.80. He gave back the change to a man named Gerald Mossman, who had overpaid by 15 cents on a chuck roast. He did not advertise. He did not raise the price. He did not speak the name of Marvin Beatty to anyone in the line, and Marvin Beatty did not speak to him again that summer. The men who came up the lane in those 9 days numbered 31 by Stanley Hollis's tally in the notebook. 22 of them were farmers. 6 of them were wives whose husbands had been in the field when the grid went down and who had driven the family pickups themselves up the dirt lane on the north shoulder of Buckhorn Ridge. 3 of them were the slaughterhouse foreman from Route 9 and his 2 sons. Every one of them was charged 18 cents a pound by the day. Every one of them was logged by family name and weight and date and time of arrival in the greasy pocket notebook, in pencil, in the kitchen at the farmhouse, in Stanley Hollis's hand. The notebook had been bought new in March of 1985 and was 3/4 full by the end of the 9 days. He laid it flat on the kitchen table on the evening of August 22nd, and Hazel made him a cup of black coffee. And they did not speak about the chairman of the co-op, who had voted against him 20 years and 5 months earlier in a meeting hall above a feed store 6 miles west on Route 14. That was the third turning point in Stanley Hollis's life, and like the first two, he did not call it a turning point. He wrote it in the notebook in pencil in his father's hand-copied template on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table at 9:43 under the kerosene lamp, with Hazel reading the Black Hollow Junction Gazette across from him, and he closed the notebook and put it in his chest pocket and went to bed. He kept the Frostbox running for another 11 years. He died in November of 1999 at the age of 95. Hazel followed him in the spring of 2003. The notebook was in his chest pocket the day he died and in his chest pocket the day he was buried, with a duplicate copy left on the kitchen table for his son and his grandson to find. In June of 2024, Daniel Hollis stood at the heavy oak chamber door at Golden Hour on the north shoulder of Buckhorn Ridge, 38 years old, lean, in a faded canvas jacket and faded Wranglers and scuffed brown boots, and he held the original 1907 USDA pamphlet folded twice in his right hand. The pamphlet was 117 years old. The pencil margins were his great-grandfather's, dated 1919, and his grandfather's, dated 1948, and now, on the inside back cover, his own, dated 2024. The chamber held at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The brass thermometer was the same brass thermometer Stanley Hollis had bought for $3.90 in 1968. He ran the Frostbox commercially now at 28 cents a pound by the day for 19 small farms in the 4 counties around Black Hollow Junction. He had a waiting list of 41 customers. The notebook in his chest pocket was the 4th in the series and the first one he had started himself. The grid had failed twice more since 1988, once in 2003 for 4 days, once in 2017 for 6 days. The Frostbox had held both times. The temperature had not risen above 43. Daniel Hollis had not raised the price either time. If you have ever stood in a hole in the ground everyone else gave up on, subscribe to the Old Man's Field. We tell these stories because some cold only proves itself slowly, and the right summer is the only thing that ever finds it. In the summer of 1968, Marvin Beatty had stood in front of a meeting hall in Black Hollow Junction, Missouri, and he had said that a hole in the ground was a hole in the ground. He had been wrong by 58 degrees in July of 1971 and by 62 degrees in August of 1988, and by every August between then and now. The hole in the ground had been 62,000 pounds of beef cold for 9 days. The hole in the ground had been a son's living and a grandson's living, and the cold supper of 19 small farms in 4 counties. It had been holding cold for 56 years. It had a great deal of cold left to hold. Some knowledge doesn't get louder when the world doubts it. It just waits.